Welcome to Lecture 14, Preserving Biodiversity, Habitat Hatches and Threats to Species Existence. This is the Introduction to Environmental Science, Unit 4, continued. We've talked about this before. Diversity, stability, biodiversity consists of these four things. Genetic diversity, if you see all those shells down there on that the lower part of that globe, all the variety of shells you see there, that's a part of genetic diversity. Species diversity, over on the far lower right hand corner, there is a variety of species. I believe that's a tropical rainforest image with a lot of different bird species in it, very different. Ecosystem diversity, different ecosystems in which those species live. Got deserts, you got, looks like a picture of a Montane lake, very cold lake, and then of course the tropics up in the upper right hand corner. And then functional diversity, variety of processes that result from how species interact. The solar energy, some organisms are primary producers, some organisms are consumers, all of those sorts of things. Biodiversity, it's very important. We're going to talk about how we protect it and how we conserve it. This map, you can see the ridges on there, those the darker red spots are where there is a lot more biodiversity. You can see large swaths of North America don't have very much. The highest biodiversity actually is in Hawaii. If you look at those peaks down there in that lower left-hand corner, those are quite red. Quite a bit of biodiversity, uniqueness, if you will, in California, but we're not exactly a poor spot. There's a hot spot here as well, up and down the central ridge of Florida, where we have a lot of endangered species, and we will talk more about why that is. So, cause of extinction and the decline of biodiversity is what we're going to be focusing on. The physical alteration of habitat. We'll go through this whole HIPCO thing, describe what exactly that acronym means. Commercial hunting and harvesting, introduction of foreign species, pests and predator control, collecting animals, biological factors contributing to extinction, and a combination of factors that actually work together. So why protect biodiversity? For, well, aesthetic reasons. Food, pharmaceuticals, scientific information, products, all kinds of things come from actually having a high level of biodiversity in certain parts of the world. This also protects free services, saves us from having to recreate them ourselves, saves money. There's also the ethics behind it. So extinction is this natural process. We have greatly accelerated. The current rate of species extinction is much higher than it would be naturally. And it certainly is not a desirable thing, but we have greatly increased how fast species are going extinct. Within this county, that's kind of a litany, a list, if you will, of the types of habitats we have: scrub, wetland, flatwood, seeps, sapping streams, things you might not have heard of. Sapping streams are really cool. I'll have to do a little talk on that sometime. Basically, they're streams that start at the top of a hill, then disappear, and then reoccur at the bottom of a hill. It really works very well in sand hills, or they suddenly spring out of the side of a hill without having any apparent upstream source. Kind of a cool thing, but they're very endangered. They're at the side of a sand hill. In this county, a big thing that's involved in our ability to actually have all this biodiversity is the vast change. Okay. No, we're not in the Rocky Mountains, but we have a lot of change in elevation relative to other parts of Florida. We also have a very stable geology. Parts of this county have been above sea level for a long time. A million years, far longer than the rest of Florida. So, this is a picture of some of that very old habitat, if you will. Xeric oak scrubs. You look at that, and this just looks like sand and some weeds. Well, actually, that community was formed by the sea, maintained by fire. 650,000 years ago, you can sort of see there in that upper right-hand corner image, that the Lake Wales Ridge was sort of in the, well, we were on the edge of a ridge that was actually out of the water. Over many thousands of years, rising and receding seas exposed and covered much of Florida Peninsula, depositing deep sands as ridges, like the ridge that runs down the middle of Highlands County. And here we are a little more recently, 325,000 years ago. This is an interglacial period when the ice caps have actually melted. Waters rose, series of ridges stood as islands in a vast ocean that covered most of Florida. That isolated them from their distant relatives. Those plants and animals developed unique characteristics. They were unique in among all of the animals up and down the ridge. Then you go to the last glacial stage. Last time there were large glaciers, and look how wide Florida has become. It is huge. At least 200 miles wider than it is currently. Spins way out into the Gulf of Mexico. Peninsula's landmass was connected to the American Southwest. And the Gulf of Mexico was much smaller than it is today. Conditions throughout Florida were drier. Plants and animals adapted to the arid conditions. Obviously, we were above sea level at that point in time, and have been, well, for a lot longer than that. Our lakes date from a period about twice as long ago as this. Some of them were formed 40,000 years ago. Time, isolation, harsh conditions. Desert, pretty harsh conditions, resulted in a large number of endemic species. Species only found in the Florida scrub. So variation in soil type and soil nutrients, as well as variations in disturbance regimes, are what bring us different sorts of habitat types. This is a map of the xeric, meaning very dry, sandy, if you will, soils in Highlands County. You can see most of that is focused up and down what we consider to be the ridge portions of the county. Oops, don't go on yet. Variation in soil types have led to a variety of scrub types. This is rosemary scrub, highest, driest. These soils there's almost no nutrients in them. How these plants grow up there is amazing. They're just able to capture nutrients from whatever source. They don't burn very often, but there's not a lot of nutrients up there to allow these plants to grow. So they don't grow very fast, but they do burn, every 50 years or so, or they should. That's what the fire return interval means. Has this plant called rosemary, which is the dominant in that picture, except for the pine trees. And then this stuff called Highland St. John's wort, Highland scrub St. John's wort, that yellow flower there. Moving a little bit further down the hill, if you will, the southern ridge sandhill has yellow sands, and they're kind of yellowish, yeah. Relatively rich in nutrients, these xeric soils are. The fire return interval on these is 5 years, 5 to 10 years at least. They need to burn that frequent to maintain this sort of a habitat. There's a lot of endemic species found in these sorts of habitats because it has a relatively higher amount of nutrients in it. The scrub mints, the Florida ziziphus, which is what that flower is, gopher tortoise, all those animals are found, or plants and animals, are found in the southern ridge sandhill. It's fairly common. Even more common is the sand pine scrub, white sand ridge, which has actually poor nutrient soils. If you don't burn them, you end up with a relatively no number of endemic species. The Florida mouse is found in this particular type of scrub. You look at this, it doesn't look as though it's dominated by oak, but it is. This oak scrubby or scrubby flatwoods, all those little yellow leaved trees out there are actually small oak trees. It's a shrub, it's not really a tree. The only large trees you'd recognize as trees are those pine trees, and there aren't very many of them. Bare sandy patches throughout, and this area obviously has to burn. Lightning is the main natural source of fire. We'll have a special lecture, if you will, lecture number 16, which will be available after you've seen lecture 15. It focuses on fire and that sort of thing, but just a brief thing on fire. Lightning ignited fire is how scrub habitat is maintained. So lightning is a fairly common occurrence here. Yes, actually. Oak scrub probably burned routinely, at least every decade or 2 decades. But where we are located in Florida, you can see there are hotter spots for lightning. The darker red the color, the more frequent the lightning. And Central Africa is the most lightning, the lightning capital of the world, if you will. We're the lightning capital of the United States. We get more lightning strikes per capita in Florida than any other state in the nation. It's estimated that every house in Florida gets struck by lightning once every 25 years. So there are a few other places that have as much lightning as we do. So lightning is a main factor in starting these fires. Why do we need to conserve this habitat? 85 to 90% of it is lost. It's turned into orange groves or turned into housing tracts. The remaining habitat is fragmented in small patches, and those patches are stuck inside non-native habitat like orange groves or housing developments. It's all over this part of Florida, not just in this county, but throughout central Florida. And we don't allow things to burn. We'll talk more about that in that lecture 16, but things are not allowed to burn as much as they should be, and those habitats have simply started not being good habitat where that fire is suppressed, and a lot of populations are actually on the decline. Those landscape patterns inhibit movements and prevent recolonization of plants. And we see a lot of extinctions, local extinctions, that are widespread. There's a lot of that going on. These ecosystems are not the only ones under threat. When you look at this idea, this thing of HIPCO, love a good acronym. I'm not sure that is a good acronym, but we use it anyway today. HIPCO, this is in order of threat, the number one threat to ecosystems, number one thing destroying ecosystems and biodiversity is habitat destruction, degradation, fragmentation, bulldozers and chainsaws, if you will. The second highest is actually the prevalence of invasive species, species that come in and displace our native species. They are a huge problem, obviously the second largest impact to biodiversity, or threat to biodiversity. Our population and resource use growth, in other words, not animal populations or plant populations, but the fact that our population, we had the population lecture earlier in this course, continues to grow. We continue to get bigger, more of us, and our resource use also grows along with it. Something we are, well, it's hard to address that. Now, number 4, kind of far down the list, one would think that pollution was a bigger deal, and pollution is a big deal, don't get me wrong, pollution is a huge deal. But as far as actually impacting species or impacting biodiversity extinction, pollution is the 4th most prevalent impact. Now, I'll go back up to population resource use growth. That kind of ties back into habitat destruction, but we separate it out. So pollution is important. It's number 4 on this list. Number 5, and someone also might be surprised that this is so far down the list, is climate change. Well, I think we have a hard time quantifying climate change because it happens in ways we can't tell. It impacts species in ways that we're not sure of. And it may or may not, we may or may not have confirmed that it is actually the cause, when it may be a far more prevalent problem with species loss than we realize. And that last point, overexploitation. And I think, what is that about? Well, in many parts of the world, particularly in the tropics, people will, poachers if you will, people who wish to sell bird species will actually collect large numbers of these birds. I think in Indonesia there are they've recorded people trapping thousands of tropical birds, parrots, and things like that, and then they'll have 3,000 of them in a shipping crate, and they will ship them someplace. And when the customs people open it up, of course it's illegal to do this, and you have to get caught. When they open up the crate, there's like 50 birds left alive out of the 1,000. So that is a huge impact to a lot of these bird species, is our exploitation. So HIPCO, habitats, invasive, population, pollution, climate, and overexploitation, those are the top, I guess, what is that, 6 reasons biodiversity is declining. And we physically altered that habitat. We look at commercial hunting and harvesting as how that many of these species are being harvested, if you will, or being removed. The introduction of invasive exotics, that's one of the topics that you can tackle in the essay, the impacts essay, there's a lot of that sort of evidence where there's a Burmese python that's been introduced into the Florida Everglades. Well, it was introduced by accident, but what sort of impact is that having? That's the sort of introduction that we're talking about. We do a lot of pest control, a lot of predator control, and sometimes the pests and the predators we control are actually the ones that we didn't mean to control. The ones that are impacted, we for example, will try to control things like coyotes, which are a pest in certain parts of the country, and we end up controlling some other organisms, some other mammals. There are a lot of collection of animals, talked about that in the previous slide, biological factors that contribute to extinction, such as the climate change things, and all these things combine together to increase extinction. Habitat destruction, this guy operating a bulldozer, that's number one. Primary cause of extinction is habitat destruction. Expansion of ag lands has happened all over the world. Global net loss of forests during the 1990s was 2.4% of all the world's forests. We have forests, we focus on forests in a later lecture, but habitat destruction, that is the main thing. And so you look at the guy operating the bulldozer. Can you really blame him for operating his bulldozer? Well, he's trying to clear some land, grow something, who knows what's going on there. But you look across the globe, this is changes in forest cover from 1990 to 2000. These countries are the top 10 in total area of forest cleared during that 10-year period. Brazil is number one. Annually, every year, they lost 0.4% of all of their forests. Indonesia, this is just by, actually, they're ranked by who lost the most every year, or what the rate was every year. 2,309, well, it says hectares times 10 to the 6th, that's a lot more than 2,300 hectares, 2.3 million hectares every year. Argentina was the bottom of that list, but still pretty high up. The highest in terms of percentage of forest lost, in terms of rate of annual change, was Nigeria, 2.6%. Looks like this groundhog is lecturing us. He's got that finger, actually he's eating, but that was a pretty good picture. Large-scale extinction happens in many areas around the world. Clearing of tropical forests for crop production. Natural grasslands, and that's where the groundhog there comes in, or the prairie dog, I'm sorry, comes in. Natural grasslands have shrunk to less than 12% of the original size. His habitat has been converted to cropland and more into grazing land, and simply the prairie dogs don't, their use of the land doesn't really match with grazing lands or other things. Even in the ocean, when you look at this graphic, large-scale extinction has really been driven in the ocean by the fact that we typically we tend to dredge up, we tend to dig things out of the ocean. In this case, that graphic shows the blue dots are how much what the relationship was between the amount of algae on the bottom of the ocean, a particular spot of the ocean, and the amount of coral in that same area. Well, in the 1970s, the ratio was pretty high in favor of coral cover. In the 1990s, it had shifted to mostly being covered with algae. That's because a lot of the coral had been destroyed. Coral reefs were destroyed not just through global warming ideas, but through dredging, through the fact that we have fishing techniques that actually will pull a dredge across the bottom and tear up a coral reef. It takes years, many years, for a coral reef to regrow. Algae, it takes just a few days for algae to regrow. So that large-scale extinction, habitat destruction, doesn't just happen on the surface, it actually happens under the water. So we polluted, dredged, and filled, and there's been a lot of eutrophication. So back to this image of biodiversity. Got those four components. You have genetic biodiversity, which is where that genetic diversity, where all the shells are. Species diversity, with the various types of birds in the forest there, in the rainforest. We have ecosystem diversity. We have deserts and grasslands and the tropical rainforests. And then you have functional diversity. Those are the four components of biodiversity. So why protect it? Well, aesthetics. The world is a beautiful place if we have a variety of things around us. A lot of our food are pharmaceuticals. We get a lot of scientific information and products from it. We have a lot of free services that are produced by the fact that we have areas of high biodiversity, and of course the ethics of protecting those things. Case in point, passenger pigeon. Passenger pigeon in 1813, Audubon, the Audubon, John James Audubon, saw a flock of pigeons fly over. It took them 3 days to fly past them. He estimated that they were flying over at 300 million per hour. That's a lot of birds. Awful lot of birds. 1813, remember that year. By 1900, they no longer existed commercially. They had been hunted to commercial extinction. I'm not sure what the commercial use for a passenger pigeon was, but they couldn't do it. That was a mere 87 years after John James Audubon had seen that 300 million per hour pass him. The last known passenger pigeon, named Dolly, died in Cincinnati in August 1914. A little more than 100 years ago, a little more than 100 years after John James Audubon saw billions of them. There's enormous numbers of these passenger pigeons. It's well documented how many of these birds there were. So what happened? First of all, how they get to have so many, how many of them? The birds nested in very dense populations. They lived in deciduous forests. Now there's one thing that during the same period of time, we'll see this later, we were taking down a lot of forests, particularly in the eastern United States. At the beginning of the period when John James Audubon saw these birds, there were 40% of the country was easily forested and deciduous forests where these birds like to live. The birds were easily killed, but they had vast numbers and they had very short nesting seasons. So they would overwhelm their predators just with their numbers. The predators didn't know what to do. I can't handle all these birds. What am I going to do? Well, a lot of them got away and they were able to reproduce easily. So we overcame this. We had guns. Commercial hunters used a thing called a stool pigeon to attract other birds in mass and kill up to 1,000 at a time. It was great sport, apparently. One professional trapper killed 3 million birds in their nesting grounds and got $60,000 for his effort, which was a lot of money in the 1880s. I think that's when that happened, was the 1880s. So they're gone. How do we avoid this in the future? Well, we need to protect that biodiversity. So this is actually a map of scrub jay nesting sites within this part of Florida in Highlands County. But what species do we protect? There are these things called endemic species, occur in a single geographic area, such as the Florida scrub jay. Actually, it doesn't just happen here in central Florida, it happens on the coast too, but they're in decline all over Florida. These endemic species, these endemic species are particularly susceptible to extinction because, remember from an earlier slide, 85% of their habitat has already been lost in this county alone. The rest of Florida isn't in that good a shape. They are susceptible to extinction because their habitat doesn't exist anymore. You can also have small isolated populations, metapopulations, that are at risk of extinction because of habitat destruction, disease, those sorts of things that happen. If they're isolated, there's not a whole lot of them. Seasonally migratory species will depend upon 2 or more distinct habitat types. If something happens in one place that the habitat's destroyed, then that species, usually bird species we're talking about, they can't survive because they have adapted to being in one place in wintertime and another place in summertime. You can also have migratory barriers. So let's consider the Nashville Warbler. The Nashville Warbler winters in Guatemala and nests in the summer. It looks like in the northern forests. Guatemala, other parts of Central America, where it spends the winter time, resting up. It's not well adapted to being cold. In the summertime, it goes into these breeding in these cooler climates, Maine to Manitoba, Pacific Northwest, very, very widespread. So if something happens in either of these environments, well, the Nashville warbler would be in trouble. So I have a question. Where does the Nashville warbler get its name? If you know the answer to this question, it's a pop quiz. Where does the Nashville warbler get its name? Well, there's a Dropbox, Lecture 14, pop quiz Dropbox. It will be open as soon as this is posted, actually. As soon as you've seen this video, you'll be able to answer that question. You may have to go online. I recommend the audubon.com website. That's where I found the answer. That's not hard, but 10 points can't hurt. This is a little different environment. This is a evening primrose found in the shale barrens of the Allegheny Mountains, Pennsylvania, New York, those places. Very specialized habitat. There's not a lot of shale barrens. Where do you find shale outcrops at the surface? It's a rare thing. Specialized habitats are very susceptible to habitat alterations. What we also tend to do in these shale areas, these shale barren areas, we tend to mine them for coal, or more recently we tend to conduct fracking operations to get the excess gas out of the ground. So very, very impacted, very rare habitats. This is the assignment for this particular lecture. Avian Ecology and the Florida scrub jay. Follow that link, Archbold Station. Florida scrub jays studied since 1969. It's been a while. They've got a lot of information on it. The assignment questions in the content section of the Florida scrub jay. Post your answers to Lecture 14, Florida scrub jay Dropbox. And that also should be available to you. Talk about biodiversity and the causes of extinction, the decline of biodiversity. HIPCO, remember HIPCO, habitat is the number one, habitat destruction is the number one reason for biodiversity to decline. Habitat alteration, let's talk about commercial hunting and harvesting. Remember we did talk about a species that we hunted to extinction essentially, the passenger pigeon. Foreign species. I mentioned a foreign species introduced to the Everglades that's causing all kinds of havoc. The Burmese python. Pest and predator control plays a major role in it. The collection of animals. Didn't go into that a whole lot, but many animal species are actually just collected and, if you will, harvested. We'll talk more about that later in terms of, in the next lecture actually, about that sort of thing. Biological factors that contribute to extinction, and that combination of factors. And the question, why, I should say also how, do we protect biodiversity? Well, why? Aesthetics. A lot of our pharmaceuticals come from these biodiversity hotspots, particularly in the tropics. Scientific information we can gain from that, and the products, and the ethics of protecting these organisms. So the references for this particular lecture.